The Cincinnati Bengals rookies and veterans have hardly practiced together at this point. Training camp months away, but we know who's on the team right now. We know what the roster looked like. Let's make a way too early 53-man roster projection.
You are Locked On Bengals, your daily Cincinnati Bengals podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What up, Bengals fans, and welcome to another episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. I'm your host, Jake Liscow. He's your host, James Rapien. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network on Locked On Bengals, covering your team every day. You can subscribe to this podcast on YouTube or anywhere you get your podcasts, and join the First Listen Club, making us your first listen every day. Become an everydayer. Like I said on yesterday's show, we've got some good film review episodes for some of the Bengals draft picks coming later this week with Mike Santagata. Today, we're going to dive into the most interesting bubble conversations on this Bengals roster, the most interesting where do they keep the extra guy conversations as we try to make a 53-man roster projection way too early before training camp. Like, this is almost certainly going to be wrong. There's going to be guys that come out of nowhere when we get to training camp and we start to learn a little bit more about the shape of this roster. But we're going to start with the most important position on the roster, James, and that's punter. No, it's quarterback, where Joe Burrow will be the starter. And I think there may be a little bit of a competition here, but I'm leaning toward the veteran that they went out and signed. I think if they were comfortable with Jake Browning, there's no reason to get somebody as experienced as Trevor Siemian. So I think Trevor Siemian is a backup here. This one isn't terribly interesting. I think they keep two quarterbacks this year either way. I don't think they have the roster space to keep three on the 53-man. So that's where I'm at the quarterback position.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think Trevor Siemian's the guy, and we'll see. Jake Browning has a shot, but I think it's an uphill climb now that they brought Siemian in.
Yeah. Tight end, another one that as of today, I think is straightforward, just because they don't, in my opinion, have a guy that threatens enough to keep the fourth spot, a guy they'd be worried about losing if they had to waive him to get him to the practice squad. Those guys being Tanner Hudson, Nick Bowers, and Christian Trahan, this year's college free agent who has some work to do to make the roster. But I think Irv Smith, Devin Asiasi, Drew Sample right now is the three guys, and we'll see if they add somebody else. But for now, that makes it really easy. And until that other guy's around, it's hard to say otherwise. And so for now, I'd say it's those three at tight end, and they're a little bit lighter at tight end, I think, but three guys.
I think the nicest thing you've ever said about any human is that Christian Trahan has a little work to do to make the roster. That's the nice, just a little work. I'm not trying to take a shot at him. Good luck to him. Hopefully he impresses. I hope all of these guys, shock these undrafted guys, shock the coaching staff and make a push for the roster. But agree with you. It's a really similar room to last year. You're just kind of missing Mitch Wilcox, which I think is one of those guys that might sneak his way back onto the roster at some point. But yeah, Asiasi and Sample behind Smith make a ton of sense. And if the season started today, I think they would only keep three tight ends.
And they kept four last year, which is why I mentioned it's a little bit light. I mean, in the initial cut down, and I think it was four for most of the year. Also, last year at the initial cut down, they only had one quarterback because they cut Brandon Allen initially, then they brought him back. And they also cut Travion Williams before they brought him back. So there's going to be some weird stuff in the initial cut down. But then it gets a little bit interesting, James, with the rest of the offensive positions, because I think there's some direct cross-position competition in wide receiver and running back for a roster spot that I think is going to be interesting, and we can talk about that. But the offensive line is also fairly fascinating to me this year. Last year, they kept 11 guys in the initial cut down, and they then immediately sent Isaiah Prince to the IR, so it ended up being 10. Could see 10 again this year. And I have them keeping 10 guys on the offensive line. That's pretty heavy for the position, but that's what this team has done more often than not. They tend to be a little bit heavy on the offensive line.
I look at it. Obviously, you have your starting five, which includes Jonah Williams, for those wondering. So those are the five. I don't need to go through them. Plus Carmen, 6, Sharping, 7, Hill, 8. And then that's where it gets interesting. Is it Adeniji? Is it a guy like Jackson Kirkland, who I think could make a push, an undrafted guy? I think that's one of the undrafted spots that could make sense. Does Deontay Smith show his worth and prove his worth? The other one is Cody Ford. I think he probably makes the team. And then you have the question mark. So there's 10 potentially, but then you have the question mark involving La'el Collins and where he's at. So I think 10 is fair, but you get to 10 very quickly. And then there's like, oh, well, there's no more empty chairs, but there's a couple guys standing that felt like they were going to make the team. So someone's going to be on the outside looking in, and that's why it's going to be hard for the Kirklands of the world, the Ben Browns of the world, to make a true push here, because there's just not many obvious spots that could be had. But never say never, and obviously the La'el Collins injury is certainly a factor.
Yeah, I have him on the physically unable to perform list. I think he's on the PUP list to start the season if he's still on the Bengals payroll. But you're right. There's 5 guys that are starting. I think Sharping and Carman are on the team, and I get to 7 before I start to have some competitions, because I think Hill, Ben Brown, if Brown is healthy, could be a competition. I think tilting Hill at this point in the season makes sense. I landed on Hill, but I do think that's a competition. And then if they keep 10, and I think they keep 10, there's kind of 4 guys for those last 2 spots, because that's 8 guys with the starting 5, Hill, Sharping, Carman. So that's 8. Then you get 2 more spots, and I think it's Adeniji, Deontay Smith, Cody Ford, and throw in your last guy, Jackson Kirkland, or whoever else out of all of the depth pieces the Bengals have currently competing, that were on the practice squad last year, Devin Cochran, Desmond Noel, et cetera. Do any of those guys make a push? Nate Gilliam. I default to Cody Ford and Hakeem Adeniji here. It gives them some guys that have played at multiple spots in Jackson Carman and Cody Ford, even Hakeem Adeniji. But I do think that's a competition for the last 2 spots. And also, this is where they could end up surprising and going, maybe they only keep 9 offensive linemen instead of 10, which wouldn't be shocking. I don't think that should be shocking. They only keep eight guys active on the offensive line on game days anyway, 7 or 8 guys active. So that could give them the flexibility to avoid one of these competitions at another spot. And I think there is a direct competition, like I mentioned, between halfback and wide receiver. You ready to dive into that conversation, James, or anything else on the offensive line?
Yeah, just offensive line wise, I do. I think there's a couple battles to pay attention to, but I think the starters are set. I think the top 7 essentially set. And that's a good spot to be in, because that hasn't been the case.
Right.
From here's your starting 5. We haven't had that in recent years going into camp talking about it. We've had to cover this position battle or that position battle. So certainly, but yeah, without further ado, let's get to the skill guys, baby. You know where my heart lies.
We'll do that because I do think there is a direct competition at the back of the wide receiver and halfback room, running back room. So we'll do that. We'll get into that conversation before we dive into the defense coming up next.
Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. The NBA playoffs continue to roll on in the conference finals, and you need to get in the game and get in the action with America's #1 sports book. Make a fast break to FanDuel during the NBA playoffs, because right now, new customers can get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's $1,000 and bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win, from single-game wagers. Maybe you want to do a same-game parlay. Maybe you want to parlay 2 different games. You can do all of those things, and it's not just NBA. From Major League Baseball, maybe you want to look into the future and see some future NFL bets. FanDuel has you covered. There's no better place to bet on all of the playoff action than America's #1 sports book. So check them out right now at FanDuel.com/lockedon to get your no sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA.
The skill positions, James, are probably your favorite part of the roster, at least not named Joe Burrow. I know you're a wide receiver at heart. And I think there's a difficult choice for the Bengals to make between 4 running backs, 7 wide receivers, because I don't really see any other positions on the defensive side of the ball or except offensive line on the offensive side of the ball where they could trim a player to try to go 4 and 7. But they're so deep at wide receiver going into camp. I think that's where it's really challenging.
There's so many guys. I mean, they have 12 guys currently on the roster at wide receiver, and a lot of them you could say, oh, well, that guy's making the team. Let's just start. Obviously, you have the big three: Chase Higgins, Boyd. Trenton Irwin was a huge contributor last year. Obviously, you have Stanley Morgan, who's been on the team for a few years now and is a big special teams contributor, really good blocker, has certain packages dedicated to him. Well, that's 5 right there. And I didn't mention Charlie Jones, who we all think is going to make the team and potentially start at punt returner. They also drafted Andre Yosevach, who they clearly like a lot. Elite athlete. Do you want to expose him to waivers to the rest of the league if you moved on from him? And that doesn't include Trent Taylor, who's obviously on the team last year, Kwame Lassiter the second. And then you have some undrafted guys, Mac Hippenhammer, Malachi Carter, Shedrick Jackson. So I think there are about 9 guys competing for maybe 7 spots, but you're right. It could be 6. And that is tough. That gets really, really tough. For me, the locks would be the big 3 and Charlie Jones, the absolute locks. And I think Trenton Irwin's close to a lock as well. But I think that those 4 to 5 would be absolute locks for me.
Based on last year, you have the hierarchy, I think, correct? Trenton Irwin, outside of the big 3, played the most snaps for them. And that includes a bunch of games when Mike Thomas was on the team getting snaps. And then Trenton Irwin really started playing more post Mike Thomas. Trent Taylor also played a solid amount and like almost doubled Stanley Morgan snaps. And I have Morgan in my too early 53, and I only have 6 wide receivers here. So maybe I should have cut one of the offensive linemen off of my 53. Maybe, Adeniji doesn't make it, and they only keep 9 guys on the offensive line, and this is how they get Yosevach onto the team. Maybe Trent Taylor surprises and sticks around too, right? But you got the 3 starters for sure. I think Trenton Irwin makes the team. I think Charlie Jones makes the team. And then is it 3 guys fighting for 1 spot? Because if that's the case, you have to feel really good, I think, about replacing what Stanley Morgan does on all those special teams units, because he plays on so many of them.
Yeah.
To feel good about replacing him, to feel good about not putting him on the 53. It could be a guy that they feel comfortable about doing what they did last year, where they cut him and bring him back. Maybe they feel like if they expose Morgan to waivers, he's not going to get scooped up. That could be the case.
That's scary. That's scary to me, because I think he would. He's valuable. He can do some things for you.
I feel like we often overestimate the chance of some of these guys, especially like who've been in the league for a long time. I don't know. Maybe not. I mean, some team could look at him and say, we have a roster spot for a special teams guy who's going to come in here and play all of our special teams units really well. And that's the end of the story. But I think it's tough. My 6 right now include Morgan, but that doesn't include Yosevach, who would be something of a surprise to not make the team. So is Yosevach in direct competition with a guy like Chris Evans? Is my question.
Yeah, I
that
think,
could be it.
I think so. I think you're right. It's how many running backs do they keep? 3 or 4, and that could impact the number of receivers and vice versa. And Yosevach, I think his key is showing that he can contribute on special teams, showing that maybe he's not the starting kickoff returner, because Travion Williams to me will be that if they keep 3 running backs specifically, but they need a backup. And so Evans, while potentially inactive on game day, would be the backup if you needed him to slide in if Travion Williams got hurt. That would make sense, right? Well, if Yosevach shows that he can do that and be a gunner and do different things, then he's going to be all right. And I think he has a chance to make the team. So as weird as it sounds, I think running back, receiver, I think they could be competing, and it might come down to that special teams unit and what both guys do for Darren Simmons' units.
Yeah. Offense obviously will play a role as well. The long-term potential with Yosevach, I think, will play a role as well. Like, do they feel comfortable exposing him to waivers? That question will need to be answered, but that could be, unless they trim on the offensive line, which the more we talk about this, the more I'm kind of talking myself into one less offensive lineman this year.
Wow. Less beef, more skill. Look at you, man. I'm impacting a little bit.
I just don't know if there's Like when you're talking about on the margins, like what's the marginal benefit of keeping the 10th offensive lineman versus the 7th wide receiver? Those are difficult decisions. Or 4th running back, whatever it is. Running back, though, outside of that last spot, I think the first 3 guys, at least right now, today, Mixon, Brown, Williams, are going to be the 3 guys, and we'll see if anything changes between now and then. If we see any dramatic changes in this room, you've talked a lot about them adding a guy here to get into the mix, but if they don't make any changes, those are the 3.
Yep, totally agree with that. And yeah, ready or not, those are the 3. I think the splits between them could be interesting. Plenty of time to discuss that, but yeah, can Chris Evans make a push for that 4th spot? Will it be Andre Yosevich? Could Trent Taylor find a way to outperform Charlie Jones on punt returns? Obviously, that would be a letdown for Jones if that happened, but certainly wouldn't want to rule that out. That said, Jake, let's switch gears. Let's flip it. And let's look at
special teams.
Yeah, right. Unless you do. I mean, we can go to special teams real quick.
We can get to the defense to finish up because special teams, there's one position to talk about, and it's Brad Robbins is going to be the punter, and the other 2 are going to be the guys that they were last year, Cal Adamitis and Evan McPherson.
What's the bigger competition, Trent Taylor versus Charlie Jones or Brad Robbins versus Drew Chrisman? Like, which one is more of a true competition, do you think?
I don't know.
Got you.
That's hard.
I got you.
That's really.
I got you.
I don't really think either is a competition.
He said the rookies got it.
I think so. What do you think?
I think Jones versus Taylor is more of a competition.
Okay.
I think Robbins is going to outperform Drew Chrisman unless Chrisman just takes a huge leap. In both our competitions, because the Bengals are going to base it on what they see. It's not like Jones's roster spot is only dependent on him being the punt returner. Yeah, Trent Taylor's is.
For sure.
Trent Taylor's is. That's how he makes the team. And so that part of it's interesting. So if I had to say, I'd say Jones, Taylor, but it's close. Both, Robbins has to perform to win the job, but I think expectations are he will. Jones has to perform to win the job, but I think expectations are he will.
Maybe it's not fair of me, but I have very high expectations for Brad Robbins.
It's fair. It is fair. Are you serious? He's a draft pick. He's a punter.
Yeah.
Absolutely fair.
How many kicks did Charlie Jones return? Are we overestimating Charlie Jones' return acumen and experience? He had 18 punt returns last year, and he's done it before that, right? It wasn't just a one-year thing. Yeah, he had 38 punt returns in 2021.
Last year, he was their star, so he only did it when they needed a little juice.
Yeah.
Like he was kind of used sparingly. The year prior, they couldn't get him the ball. So they were like, hey, go back there and punt returns because we can't get you the ball otherwise at Iowa. Man,
he put the
Iowa
ball
offense.
He put the ball on the ground once on 76 punt returns in his college career.
Yeah.
I feel like that's a pretty good track record. I think.
And Taylor was a little shaky at the end of last season.
Taylor put one on the ground in terms of a muffed punt on 38 punt returns last year. Darius Phillips had 2 muffed punts, so that's very memorable. That's why Trent Taylor got the job in 2021. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a pretty solid rate of muffed punts. You obviously want to see 0, but he had a really good, productive career as a college punt returner. So it's not like he's never done it. I think he hits the ground running there.
Yep, totally agree. Up next, let's talk about the defense, where there's plenty of competition, plenty of depth, and not many spots available. So we'll dive into that coming up next.
Where on the offensive side of the ball, the primary competitions are at the end of the wide receiver room, the end of the offensive line room, maybe the end of the running back room. On defense, there are conversations at every position, I think, where there are bubble guys to talk about. And let's start on the defensive line. This is going to be another one of those very heavy in terms of number of players, roster spots for the Cincinnati Bengals. And how many edge guys can they keep? Because right now there are 7 guys, including Jeff Gunter, who they've invested to some degree in. And I really wonder, you look at last year, they kept 5 guys on the edge, 5 guys on the interior. And if they do that again, they don't have that depth on the interior this year to really push the guys that I'm going to have making it on the inside. But whether they keep an extra guy on the edge is going to depend on how comfortable they are with those guys kicking inside, because of where the balance of defensive ends versus defensive interior players are. So for Terrell Basham, with the draft pick of Miles Murphy, things get pretty interesting there, because I think Cam Sample's got to have a leg up there.
Mm-hmm. I would agree with you. I think just interior, let's knock them out. Reeder, Hill, Tupou, Carter, Tufele. I think those are your 5. Hubbard, Murphy, Hendrickson, Osai, lock. All right, so we're already at 9.
Yep, you get one more.
Right, and so I would give the edge to Sample. And so Sample, there's 10. Terrell Basham's on the outside, Jeff Gunter, Raymond Johnson, Owen Carney, all on the outside. You obviously have some of the interior guys too not making it. Dominic Davis, noteworthy. Maxwell, noteworthy. The undrafted free agent. So we'll see. But there's not much. There's not much room. And Terrell Basham came here to help them win a title. And I think that's part of it. Is you look at it and they're going to have to move on from one of these guys, or if they have any injuries, they're going to have a pretty solid player, solid veteran, potentially sliding in. The other thing with Osai, just to monitor how healthy he is. I know he's going through rehab again, and I know everything's rosy when you're going through it. But will he be ready? That's certainly something to pay attention to in this room. But if he is, Basham could be on the outside looking in and is certainly competing with Sample, I would say. And, man, Sample played well last year, I thought. I thought he took a step. So we'll see.
That could be where and why Basham is on the team, is the Osai rehab. If Osai needs to start the year on the pup list or whatever it is, then that's where having Basham is such a luxury, because you don't often make it through training camp entirely healthy. Obviously, knock on wood, you hope that they get out of there as healthy as they can, but you tend to have some guys that are dealing with some injuries. And so having this depth, on the offensive line, where they have a lot of guys, even if you want them to go sign Dalton Risner to really bolster their interior offensive line depth and the floor on their interior offensive line. Same can be said on the defensive line here on the edge. So that'll be interesting. That's one of the big battles to watch. And then at corner, it's another spot where they've added a draft pick, added 2 draft picks, in fact, to a spot where you felt pretty good about their depth before the draft. And then you add DJ Turner, you add DJ Ivey. Cheeto on track by all accounts, and we'll see. But by all accounts, he's on track to be ready for the start of the season. Cam Taylor-Britt, Mike Hilton, DJ Turner, those are your locks. I think Jalen Davis is nearly a lock, unless they think DJ Turner is going to be the backup slot. So then, say Davis has to compete. I think he does. It's Sidney Jones, Jalen Davis, DJ Ivey, Allen George, 4 guys for 2 spots. And then there's a couple other guys, Marvell Tell, Chris Lamons also on the team competing, but it's probably mostly those 4 guys for those 2 spots.
It's tough. It's tough because you look at it. I like Allen George. I think he's a good player. Sidney Jones, when they signed him, I was like, that's a great value signing. Get a guy like that. Who mentioned, by the way, that there was some interest on the Bengals end when he cleared waivers last year, but he had already committed going to the Raiders. So that part is interesting too. It's not like they just randomly did that. They just didn't want that contract. That's why they didn't claim him. No one did in the league. But I think there was some interest there. But yeah, I think Davis makes it. I think obviously, so you have Hilton and Davis in the slot. Taylor-Britt, and then I'll leave Jones out for now. Awuzie Turner. I'm already at 5. I think Jones makes it. And so if there's no injuries, like Allen George, I think he's a good player. I think DJ Ivey, there's a reason that they signed him or didn't let him get to undrafted free agency and use that 7th round pick on him. So it's going to be a battle here, and they do have depth. I mean, this is as deep as they've been in a while, and you feel really good about it, I would say, because even if Cheeto isn't ready, and I guess that's the other question, maybe he's not. Maybe they're like, let's give you 4 weeks. And so you have depth there where you can do that and you don't have to rush him back, which I do think. I think he's going to be ready, but if he's not, you don't have to rush him. If he's at 88%, You don't have to say, all right, let's start the season.
Obviously, don't rush him, but you really hope he's ready.
No doubt. He's the best of the room. He's the best of the room for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and you hope for Taylor, Britt, and Turner to hit that point in the near future so that they get to Cheeto's level. But I have so much respect for Cheeto's game at corner. I think he's fantastic. Linebacker, James, I think is pretty cut and dry. I only have them keeping 5 here. I don't see how they can keep 6 given the other positions we're talking about. And that is exactly the guys we've talked about at the position in the past: Logan Wilson, Jermaine Pratt, Akeem Davis-Gaither, Marcus Bailey, and Joe Bacci. And Clay Johnston, not on the team anymore, actually led the Bengals in special teams snaps last year. But if they were keeping 6, then Keandre Jones, and these guys will compete. Marcus Bailey, Joe Bacci, Keandre Jones, Shaka Hayward, Jalen Moody. These guys will compete for some of those fringe spots, but I think those 5 guys are pretty well set.
Yep. Pratt, Wilson, Bacci, Davis-Gaither, Bailey. That's it. You're right. And maybe someone emerges, maybe something happens, but those feel like the 5. And I feel like they have a good linebacker unit. It's wild just doing this exercise. You're like, man, this is a good team. There are not many areas where I point to and say, I'm really, really worried right there. They might have some questions. They're not perfect, but man, are they deep at a lot of the key areas that you need to be deep at. And we've seen it. Attrition happens, injuries happen. And I think this team is as deep as they've been during this 3-year run.
Last position to talk about, and then we can talk about some of those question marks if we have time. But last position is safety. And again, the way that I've got 10 guys on the defensive line, 10 guys on the offensive line, 4 running backs, 6 receivers, because I have Evans sneaking on instead of Yossi Vashon. And the more we talked about it, the more I kind of want to change that and take Evans off, put Yossi Vashon on, take an offensive lineman out to keep Yossi Vashon, just because I think they're going to see that athleticism, want to keep him. But back at safety, I got 4 guys, and that means I can't find a spot for Mike Thomas.
Yeah, it's tough. He's such a leader in that locker room, but you look at it, Scott, Hill, Battle, lock. Anderson, you feel pretty good about him. There's a reason that they traded up for him and kept him on the roster last year, even though he was nicked up and all of those things. Thomas, Brandon Wilson, by the way, I don't know why he's still listed on some depth charts. He's not on the roster. No one really else. Yusuf Corker and Larry Brooks, I don't think either one of those guys is in the running. So, yeah, Thomas, it's a matter of, do you keep 5, health, all of those things. But, this could be that could be one. But he is valuable on special teams. That matters. And so one of those question marks, can they make it work roster gymnastics wise? And this part of it, I think, with a guy like Mike Thomas, is so dependent on health, who can start the season on time, all of those things. And it's not just the safety room as a team, because depending on who gets nicked up, someone in the running back room could get nicked up, and then Thomas becomes that much more valuable on special teams, or a corner gets nicked up and now Thomas is more valuable on special teams. So we'll see what happens there. But I agree with you. I think that the back end of that safety room is quite interesting.
Tyson Anderson and Jordan Battle should be playing special teams unless Jordan Battle is like a full-on starter really early. And if he is, then Nick Scott is playing special teams. Dax Hill played a lot of special teams last year. This year, I mean, Tyson Anderson was largely not only drafted, obviously, but he played a ton of special teams in college. So that's where I get to 53, James. 4 safeties. Maybe I'm heavy on the offensive line. The more we talk about it, I've said it a few times, the more I talk myself into 9 guys there. But that's also one of the question marks on the team, right? Like you talk about them not really having many questions. Interior defensive line, pass rushing depth, and interior offensive line depth are the 2 spots where it's like, they could get a little bit better there. Tight end depth for receiving tight end after Irv Smith. That's where they could get a little bit better. But outside of those questions, maybe we should have done this before we did the schedule game, James. Maybe you would have. I mean, you're not going to change your convictions. Maybe you would have felt better about the team in that 4-3 start you had them off to.
13-4. So you could say 4-3 all you want. 13-4.
I'm done with slow starts, James.
This is where I had them. They didn't start slow in 21. People think they did. They started 5-2. And I have them starting. I have them starting 4-1. By the way.
Well, then
they
losing 5-4. Right?
Yeah, because they lost 2 games. I get it. They were inconsistent, but they didn't start slow.
Yeah, but let's not do slow starts or inconsistent starts anymore.
How about you just do 17-0 and Jake will woo every week? Let's go.
Well,
every week.
Nope. Vetoed. That's going to do it for this episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. The Bengals have...
It's a new year. Jake Liscow, still lame.
I mean, that's rude. But James will be with you to cover the Bengals open practice this week. Then we've got Mike Santagata joining James to talk about some of the Bengals rookies, some of the film takeaways as Mike has grinded the tape on all those guys. That's coming your way later this week on Locked On Bengals. Until next time, hoo day and have a good one.